Okay, well, for all of you that are here, I'm having a roundhouse uh, talk with Anthony Cooley. He lives in Lakeside. Anthony is the great grandson of C.E. Cooley, which is of the Show Low naming process. And I'll let him talk a little more on that. And we also do have John Rushcamp here and Ira Harris. And we'll just have a little roundhouse discussion amongst us. Anthony will be talking about the Arizona territories, from White River to Show Low to Holbrook.
That's pretty much it.
Well, if you have something you want to introduce yourself and give a little background.
Okay. My name is Anthony Cooley. C.E. Cooley and Molly, his wife, were my father's grandparents. I thought we'd talk today about C.E. Cooley's life, what's known of it. He claimed he was from Loudoun County, Virginia, which is up near where West Virginia, Maryland, and Virginia all come together. No record of his birth or early life has been found back there, although one of the descendants, another one of his descendants, a man named Lonnie West, who does a lot of research and is really good at finding things on computer, old documents and whatnot. He has a line on what might have been his family back there. Anyway, he came west before the Civil War in the 1850s. Nobody's really sure when he got out here, but the earliest record of him is up in what the area is now Denver in 1859. He owned some property up there of a town company that formed where Denver is now. The place was called Aurora. And he was one of the owners of one of the lots there. So there's a record of him being there. It turns out that Aurora was kind of swamped because another company formed the Denver Town Company on the other side of the valley. And when first the stagecoach and then the railroad came through, they were on that side of the valley. So it's now Denver instead of Aurora that everybody knows about. Later on, he came down into northern New Mexico, Santa Fe, and Albuquerque. So when the Civil War started, he was already in New Mexico, and he signed on as a lieutenant and quartermaster for the 2nd New Mexico Volunteer Infantry. And he served there during the Civil War. He was, most of the time, as near as from records we can find, he was on what was called detached service. He was a quartermaster scrounging around everywhere to get the things that the volunteers would need to fight. That was, mostly food, but also canvas and, of course, gunpowder if you could get it. But that sort of thing. The more military aspect of it was provided. Guns and ammunition had to come from the United States military. Some of it was available, in stores and whatnot, but mostly he was out looking for, traveling around all over the place trying to get supplies. He was probably engaged in a couple of battles that were not the major battles, but rather skirmishes of trying to provide, there's some records of him having a wagon full of stuff and having to defend it while they got away from Southern people. Basically, the Civil War was the Texans came up out of Texas and came up the Rio Grande. And the first battle was at Val Verde early in 1862, I think in February, it was more or less a draw, but the Union forces kind of lost their nerve and they retreated back behind the walls of Fort Craig. and that left the Confederates free to move up the Rio Grande. They occupied first Albuquerque and then Santa Fe. Raised the Confederate flag over Santa Fe, and then there was another fort. The Union forces, a lot of them, except the ones that were behind the fort in Fort Craig, they went to a place called Fort Union, which is between Santa Fe and Colorado. And the Southern forces came out of Santa Fe to attack them. The Northern forces came out of Fort Union to meet them. They met at a place called Glorieta Pass, Apache Canyon. What the South didn't know was that about 500 Colorado volunteers had come down. So while everybody else is engaged in a fight in this canyon, the Glorieta Pass, the Colorado volunteers, they kind of went over a mountain and circled around and attacked the South's wagon train that had all their supplies, ammunition, food, all that stuff. They attacked and burned the wagon train, destroyed it. So that left the Confederates with nothing to do but retreat. And they headed back for Texas, back through Santa Fe, back through Albuquerque. But they'd left this force of Union forces behind in Fort Craig, so they couldn't just go down the Rio Grande. They had to go out into the desert and try and circle around and get back to Texas, and a great many of them died. And they tell me you can still find old Civil War stuff on that out in the desert where they abandoned their rifles, guns. You can still find, like belt buckles and all that kind of stuff. Not much anymore, of course, but you might still be out there with if you figured out where those guys, because it was kind of like every man for himself, get back to Texas kind of thing. And they retreated all the way back to San Antonio, and that was the end of the Civil War in New Mexico, basically. But anyway, there's a record of him. You can find documents and that sort of thing of how he served in New Mexico during the Civil War, and was engaged in some of those battles. Near the end of the Civil War, after the South had already retreated, he got sick. And there's a record of him asking for sick leave first. One of them says, I'm near death, don't know if I'm going to make it kind of thing. And he was going up to the hot springs in Las Vegas, New Mexico, which is, again, between Santa Fe and Colorado. It's where that big fire is burning right now, actually, is right near Las Vegas, New Mexico. Anyway, apparently the hot springs did the trick because he recovered from that after he had already resigned from the military. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. After the battle with the Confederates was over, they dismissed pretty much all of the volunteer regiments that had been formed in New Mexico, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever. And they created one, 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry, with Kit Carson was the colonel in charge of it. And Cooley accepted a position as 1st Lieutenant and Quartermaster for the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry. It was after that he got sick and had to request, to give up his commission. That was finally accepted in 1863, I think. By the time he went through the chain of command, he'd been sick by then for 6 months or something, and they accepted his resignation. So he never really fought with the New Mexico volunteers. He was not involved in after basically the war part with the South was over. They started fighting Indians, the Jicarilla, Navajo, Mescalero, whoever. Some of them even came into Arizona. Anyway, he was not a part of that. But there's a record of him later becoming the manager of the hotel at the Las Vegas Hot Springs, where he had been recuperating. So for a while, it was known as a place in New Mexico in those days. There wasn't much health care, and it was known as a place to go where you could try and recover the hot springs supposedly had these miraculous properties and it was a place where people went and stayed to try and recover from various illnesses. And he ended up being a manager of a hotel there, kind of what we call a hotel. It wasn't much, but anyway, so there's a record of him being there. Then there's later on in 1868, I think there's a record of him being one of the partners in buying up one of the old Spanish land grants in New Mexico. But he was primarily, the reason he was there was prospecting. He was always prospecting, no matter what, he went all over the place with others, different groups. They were always prospecting for whatever, gold, silver, anything they could.
Right.
Yeah. And they bought this land grant. And it turned out that there's a court decision along the way where these Spanish land grants had to be honored by the United States when they took them over. But since the King of Spain had kept all mineral rights to himself, when the United States honored these land grants owned by individual people, they decided that, well, all mineral rights belong to the government. Not the King of Spain anymore, but now the government of the United States. So when they found out that, they sold out because they were, they had the right to this land, but they couldn't have any of the mineral rights that were in the land. So they could run cattle or harvest timber or whatever, but that wasn't why they were there. So they sold it.
Well, in those days, was New Mexico a state by that time?
No.
So
it's a territory.
It was still a territory.
Actually, in 1863, at a place called Navajo Spring, which is like now it's called Denebitu, which is Navajo Spring in Navajo. Some representatives of the United States government came into Arizona, and they declared it the territory of Arizona in the winter of 1863. So that before then, Arizona and New Mexico had been the territory of New Mexico. And so in the middle of the Civil War, some guys came just far enough into Arizona to be in Arizona and declared the territory of Arizona for the Union forces, for the United States. So anyway, from about somewhere in that same time frame, 1868, 1869, Cooley and a couple of his friends are up in Zuni, and they meet an Apache leader from the Carrizo Apache. His name was Hashkiba, but everybody knew him as Miguel. He had lost one eye, so some people knew him as One-Eyed Miguel. Well, Miguel had been up to one of the peace meetings that had been held up near Fort Wingate when they released the Navajos from Bosque Redondo and let them go back up into the Four Corners area. They established there'd been an old Fort Wingate. They put a new Fort Wingate in a different place south of Gallup, and to kind of take care of the Navajos who had gone back into their own traditional territory. And Miguel had heard about this peace meeting that was been organized, and he went all the way over into New Mexico to try and arrange some kind of arrangement. Because at this time, a lot of New Mexico and Arizona is being claimed by the Americans who are coming in. And he was trying to make some kind of arrangement that would allow him to stay on his own land and he'd be protected and whatnot. So he was always Miguel was always trying to work a peace agreement with somebody. Eventually it works out. Anyway, the Cooley and a man named Dodd and another guy named Banta, who was going by a different name at the time. He was going by the name Charlie Franklin at the time. But they meet Miguel, and Miguel agrees to bring him back into Arizona, into his country, into Apache country, where everybody was afraid to go. Nobody knew anything about it because so few white people had ever been in that area, or Mexicans either, Spanish either, because it was controlled by Apaches. But everybody was looking for this Doc Thorne's gold mine, where he supposedly had found this stream loaded with nuggets and stuff. And everybody believed it was true. And there were some clues about where the place was. And they were in this part of Arizona. Miguel, Sombrero Butte down on Lower Salt River is one of the clues, supposedly. Anyway, Miguel agreed to bring these three prospectors into his country and go with him and try and find this place. So they happened to be in the summer of 1869. These three guys, Cooley, Dodd, and Banta, are camped with Miguel on Carrizo Creek when Major Green, actually they call him, he was a brevet lieutenant colonel at the time, so I guess it's Colonel Green, led the first Army expedition up into the White Mountains.
Is that John Green?
Yeah.
Colonel John Green.
Colonel John Green. Yeah. He was actually a major, but because he was in charge of the expedition, they gave him a breveted rank of lieutenant colonel. And he was members of the 1st Cavalry and I think the 8th Infantry, I think 21st Infantry. Anyway, a bunch of 100 and some odd guys come up from the Gila River up through what now is the San Carlos Reservation. They cross Black River, come over to White River, and they had a couple of skirmishes on the way up. And it's a punitive expedition. They think they're going to attack any Apaches they find. I mean, that was their mindset. That's what had been going on in southern Arizona and New Mexico for years. And they expected to come up and along the way, they destroyed any cornfields they found. They killed a few people that they ran into. Then they get to the White Mountains, about where Canyon Day and Fort Apache, White River is now. And Miguel hears that these guys are coming. He knows they're coming from days before they ever show up. So when he hears that they're camped down on Black River, Cooley and Dodd and Miguel and Miguel's brother Diablo and some others, they go to find them. They go to meet them. When they get to it, they leave Banta behind on Carrizo Creek. And when they get over to Black River, they found out that the cavalry had already moved up to White River. So they go on up there and they meet with Colonel Green. Well, Colonel Green, he doesn't really believe them. He thinks they're most likely selling guns and whiskey to the Apaches and, but he does talk with them. He meets with them and quietly, they have this non-combative meeting. And the next day, he sends Captain Barry and about 50 troopers, along with Cooley and Miguel, back over to Carrizo. And he tells this Captain Barry, if you can, kill them all. Depending on what you find, what the circumstances are. But, that's what we're here for. So they go back over to Miguel's place on Carrizo Creek. And as they're approaching, all these women and kids, most of the village is coming out to meet them. And there's white flags flying all over the place, and they come out with baskets of corn that they're handing out to all the soldiers and using Spanish, soldado bueno, you guys are all great. So Captain Barry, he later says he it would have been cold-blooded murder to attack those people, and he didn't do it. That first night, Cooley tells Banta, who is there, they're spending the night there, kind of under guard, as it were, almost. And he tells him what he's heard Colonel Green tell Barry the day before about it. And so they're kind of sweating it through the night that the cavalry in the morning is going to attack all these people. Even though they spent the night there, And Banna wants to tell everybody and have them flee into the mountains, so they don't all get killed. So Cooley goes back over and he talks with Captain Barry in the middle of the night, like midnight or something, and gets him to admit that, no, we're not going to attack these people. We won't do that. It's one of the, to their good, good on you. They decide not to attack the people. And the next day they have a conversation with Miguel and tell him that, well, yeah, you went into New Mexico and made a deal, but that doesn't have anything to do with Arizona. That's a whole other department. So you got to go down to Fort McDowell and see the commander down there who's in charge of this part of Arizona and make your peace arrangements with him. So the three guys, Cooley, Banta, and Dodd, and Miguel and some others, take off and they go through the mountains down to Fort McDowell. And they do make an arrangement and then come back. Well, Miguel comes back. Cooley, Dodd, and Banta, they go on to Prescott. They form another expedition to go prospecting. They go down through where Phoenix is now, which at that time was pretty much nothing, a few people living there. And they come back up the Salt River, trying to get back into the same area that they tried to get to with Miguel from above. They now circle all the way around and come back up the Salt River, trying to do some prospecting. They make it up about as far as the mouth of Canyon Creek from there, which is like the last creek on what's now the Apache Reservation. And they run into some totally different Apaches and have a little bit of a, shoot at each other from a distance. And and Cooley and his guys decide to turn around and go back, basically. Now, so meanwhile, Colonel Green has run into all these peaceful Apaches, so he doesn't know quite what to do. He becomes the idea that, hey, we really ought to create a reservation here. These people are peaceful, they're self-sufficient, there's no valuable minerals around, there's no vast farmland around, there's nothing, it's far from anybody. So this would be a great place to create a military reservation and a post. And when he goes back down to first Fort Goodwin and Camp Goodwin, Camp Grant, down on the Gila and the San Pedro rivers, back down there, and talks with all the superior people, the commander of the Department of the Pacific in in San Francisco. This was part of the Department of California and the District of the Pacific or something like that. And so the commanding structure was in San Francisco. And they agree with him. So within that year, he comes back up in 1869 at the end of the year, and decides on a place to build a military post where the White River and the White River, North Fork of the White River and the East Fork of the White River come together, which is where Fort Apache is now. They decide to build that post. And he goes back down again. In the following spring, they start building a road up from Fort Goodwin. It goes, or Camp Goodwin. It's follows the Gila River downstream for some miles, then crosses it and starts climbing up towards where Fort Apache is now. It's about a 75-mile trip. And they start trying to build a road up there. And they send some other people on ahead, and they basically begin building in the spring of 1870 what will become Fort Apache. It goes through a bunch of name changes right away.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. First, they called it Camp Ord. Within a month or so, they changed it to Camp Mogollon. Within a month or so after that, they changed it to Camp Thomas. And eventually, I think it's early in 1871, less than a year from when they started, they changed the name to Camp Apache. And it stays Camp Apache until 1879 when it becomes Fort. of Fort Apache. They decide they're going to keep it there, in other words, and it becomes Fort Apache. But so while all this is going on, Cooley spent that year, apparently left Arizona in the winter of 1869, 1870, went back into northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, still prospecting, and spent the winter up there. In 1870, when he hears that they're creating this new post in where we will just call it Fort Apache because I'm trying to keep up with the name changes. Anyway, he hears that that's happening and he comes back into Arizona. Exactly when, nobody's quite sure, but he is there fairly early on, and he meets and marries two Apache ladies. He actually married Molly, who was there was another chief. There's three chiefs basically involved in that area that kind of run things. Miguel is over on the Carrizo Creek. There's one known as Escatacila, and his country starts basically, Fort Apache is in his territory, and on to the south and east from there. He's for things we won't even go into here. There was another group of what they usually refer to as a Western White Mountain under a chief known as Pedro. Again, he has an Apache name, but it's virtually unpronounceable in English. So there's some sounds that Apaches make in their language that just do not exist in the English language.
For sure.
And very subtle changes in tones and stops and all kinds of things that change everything. So anyway, Pedro lives along the North Fork of the White River and on over into what Corduroy Creek and that area. They're known as the Chachiden, which Chachiden is named after a particular rock formation on the upper Carrizo Creek, which they view as where they originated from. Anyway, he marries, some say, Pedro's daughters. That's probably true. They say that he is, the daughters were Alchacé's sisters. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think perhaps Apache men quite often had many wives, more than one anyway, and usually not more than four. But I think perhaps Alchacé was, some say he was Pedro's nephew, some say son. You know, how exactly that relationship is, I don't know. I suspect that they were actually what we would call first cousins, because they probably had the same father but different mothers. So half brother, half sister, cousin. It's really difficult. Apache kinship system is different again. It's a matrilineal society, so their way of figuring close kinship as opposed to distant kinship. You're the same clan as your mother, and therefore mothers, two sisters who have children are almost regarded as mothers, and they're what we would call cousins, are all like brothers and sisters, because it all comes down through the female side. That relationship is much closer than the way we do it, which is basically equal on either side.
Right.
Anyway, he marries into the tribe. Exactly when, we don't know. Molly's sister came along as part of the deal. That was kind of also Apache tradition. If a man could support more than one wife, he was actually kind of expected to look after her. Anyway, we don't know exactly when that happened, but their first child, Belle, who would become Belle Amos, was born in the April of 1872. So we know for sure that he was already married into the tribe by the spring or summer of 1871. And one of the pictures we have is of a cabin he built on the North Fork up in Molly's people's country. It's down where it is now, down in the bottom of the canyon near Alchesay Fish Hatchery, just downstream a little ways from Alchesay Fish Hatchery. Nobody knows exactly where that is, but by comparing the background of an old photograph taken in 1873 of the cabin, you can kind of match up the hills in the background and the flat area in front and get a pretty good view of where it was. Anyway, so in 1872, Cooley goes to work as interpreter for the Post. He's hired for the first time as an interpreter, and so he is there.
And you say the Post, is that Fort Apache?
Fort Apache, okay. Right. And he's there when a man named Collier comes. Vincent Collier was a member of the Peace, I forget what they were called, Peace Commission or something. Anyway, he comes to Arizona to try and create peace with the Apaches. He creates the reservation at Fort Apache and other places. He goes down to Camp Grant, Fort McDowell, a place called Beale Spring, another place called Camp Date Creek. He creates these reservation and feeding stations where if these various tribes, he goes around to a lot of other tribes, not just Apaches, and creates these places where they will be safe from attack and can be fed and clothed if they'll stay there. Now, this works okay for a while, but there are a lot of Apache groups and other Native American groups who are not included inside these reservations, so they kind of left out. And the depredations that are going on down in southern Arizona just continue. He had no meetings at all with the Chiricahua under Cochise, who down in southeastern Arizona. So they have, the wars essentially going on in other places, right. Not at Fort Apache. At Fort Apache, everything's cool, pretty much. There's a thing called the Camp Grant Massacre in 1871. Some of the survivors of that came up into Escatasilas area. They were related clan relationships, and they had relationships for years. So anyway, they attack the fort and they steal some livestock, but Pedro and Miguel, they're not any part of that. In fact, when the military, they actually helped the military go out and try and do something about that. They ended up killing about a half a dozen of Escatasilas people. Anyway, then Collier comes, he makes peace. Not long after him, that didn't work out so well. So a guy named the next year, a general named O. Howard comes to the area. He does essentially the same thing. He creates a little bit larger White Mountain reservation that includes San Carlos down all the way down to the Gila River. He gets rid of some of the ones that Collier had created and forces those people to move on to the bigger reservations at Camp Verde and what is now the White Mountain Reservation that goes all the way from the Mogollon Rim to the other side of the Gila River. Of course, the government starts taking pieces of that back almost immediately. Within a year, they take off. It used to go from the border of New Mexico all the way over, and they take that whole part away almost immediately. It's because of the mines at Morenci and Clifton. Then they take away another part of the upper Gila River because it has such good farmland that can be easily irrigated. So they take that part. And then there's some parts down near Globe, dripping springs in that area down in there that's known to be rich with minerals. So they take that part away. And kind of shrink it. The reservation's still huge, but those valuable pieces that they were probably not going to be able to defend from American interests anyhow. And they were not particularly interested to the Apaches anyway. It was not essential to their lifestyle. So anyway, so through those next few years, 1872, 73, 74, Cooley continues to work with the military. As later on, there's another picture here we have of Troop A of the Apache Scouts out of Fort Apache. It was taken the first week of October, 1874. And the people in the picture, the obvious ones are George Crook, the commander of the department, General George Crook, and next to him is a guy named Randall. Major Randall, he was in command of the post at Fort Apache. There's also in the picture is C.E. Cooley. He was being paid as both an interpreter and a guide. So he's really cashing in. He gets about $75 for being the interpreter a month, and another 50 to say the very few time, but another $50 to $75 a month for being the guide. They are engaged in several skirmishes, campaigns against the Apaches, mostly in the Tonto Basin. That's that war, that Tonto War or Crook's Winter Campaign, 1872-73, continued on into 1874, where they basically what would you say, quieted the Tonto Basin, the Tonto, northern southern Tonto people they called Dilje. They were essentially defeated and put onto reservations, first at Camp Verde and at Camp McDowell, and later moved to San Carlos.
And these are all different Apache tribes.
Right, different Apache groups. It's hard to, Apache groups are really pretty small. Based mostly on clan and bands. The White Mountain Apache tribe now is made up of about what used to be about 4 different bands on the west end, Carrizo, Canyon. Let's see, Canyon Creek, Grasshopper, and Sibique are kind of all one. Carrizo is kind of another. The North Fork is another, and then the East Fork or Southeast Corner was another. That even exists in their tribal structure today. They have 4 different districts, and it's based primarily on where these 4 different bands used to live. There's also about 64 different clans. And they're broken down into 4 different, I forget the phratries, 4 different phratries, which is what an anthropological term for a group of related clans.
Right. Well, basically, they could have had some real friendly tribes and then some that are adversarial tribes.
Even the most of the battles and the people that were being killed eventually on the reservation was one Apache band fighting against another. There was, except for that first encounter at the very beginning, when following the Campground Massacre, there were no more military fighting Apaches on the White Mountain Apache Reservation or in the White Mountain area. They simply weren't any. But a number of the chiefs got killed fighting with each other.
Okay.
And it had nothing to do with anything to do with it, other than the fact that they'd been forced together around the fort because of all the battles that were going around. The military kind of forced them all to come in close together around the fort where they could keep an eye on them. And that created these situations where these guys who had battles in the past before the white men show up are now concentrated together. And they had a tendency to drink tulipie and gamble and fight with each other. And a lot of the early leaders of the Apache tribe, Miguel most specifically, get killed in these kind of inner tribal rivalry battles. Anyway, so in those years of 72, 73, 74, Cooley is with the Apache Scouts fighting other Apaches, mostly in the Tonto Basin area and along the Mogollon Rim over towards between here and Sedona, more or less. There's several skirmishes where he's listed as being the commander of the Apache Scouts. They fight 2 or 3 battles in the Sierra Ancha and the Matazals. where there is no military there. He's a civilian guy leading Apache scouts, and they have 2 or 3 battles in that area where the scouts there are very few people who could keep up with the Apache scouts in the field. They just, by the time the military showed up, the battle's over. Yeah, they just took care of it themselves, as it were. And later on, there's a picture of the Apache scouts that is taken in the first week of October 1874. I'm sure the camera was there, the photographer was there, because George Crook happened to be at Fort Apache during that week. So we know when that picture was taken, because that's when he was at Fort Apache.
Well, you can just tell me when you want to start looking at some of the pictures.
Oh, okay. Well, why don't we show the first one?
Okay, let's see. See if I can get these to come up.
Okay, yeah, that first picture, you can just barely see it. It's down along the left-hand side there.
Right, the cabin right
yeah,
there.
Yeah, that's the cabin right there. And that's the cabin he built. That picture was taken by a member of the Wheeler, Lieutenant Wheeler's expedition. He was a surveyor who came through Arizona, basically creating maps. And a member of the expedition took that picture, and that's for Cooley's cabin on the Upper North Fork, about 8 to 10 miles north of Fort Apache. That was taken in 1873. If you want to go to the next one, that's a picture of Troop A Apache scouts out of Fort Apache. The man in the middle wearing the pith helmet is George Crook. Right there. On his left is Major Randall. That's the commander of the post at Fort Apache. To his left is Lieutenant Riley. He's been misidentified in virtually every picture I've ever seen of this. And he was the commander of the troop. He was a 5th Cavalry commander of the Apache Scouts. You want to keep going to the left. That next one is Severiano. He was a Mexican who was raised with Miguel's family in the Carrizo Apache, and he acted as an interpreter. They very much trusted him. He had a fairly influential man in the tribe, even though he was a Mexican who was raised by them and married into the tribe and spent his whole life with them. He never went back. Next to him is a guy named Diablo. That was Miguel's younger brother. And he's now one of the head chiefs because Miguel was killed, like I said, in one of these confrontations about 6 months before this picture was taken. Miguel was killed in a confrontation with other Apaches, some of Pedro's people, actually. And the one on the outside there, that is, his name was Patone, and he was related to Pedro, a nephew perhaps. And he took over as head chief. He's listed as head chief at this time of all the Apache people. Now, all the Apache people didn't think of him as head chief, but the military regarded him as the head chief. So he was the guy they would go to when there was a problem locally. And you're our guy. You go find out who did these things and solve it. You know, that's the head chief was created by the military, not by the Apaches. Okay, if you go over to the other side, yeah, that's a Lieutenant Ross. He's General Crook's adjutant, which is kind of like a secretary. Mm-hmm. And right next to him, the guy that's all in white and almost invisible, that's C.E. Cooley. He was a guide and interpreter at the time. He was double dipping. At a time when a sergeant made $15 a month, he was taking home about $150 a month, not unlike the contractors in Afghanistan now or wherever. Anyway, if you want to come down to the front row, the only other ones we know, that first guy on the right here. Yeah, that's Sergeant Alchese. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his services in the campaign of 1872-73. Right behind him, the next one, that one, yeah, that's his brother Euclene. And the next one to him is Mose. Mose continued to be an Apache scout for years. He was the only scout that did not mutiny at Cibecue Creek in 1881. He was a sergeant, and he was the only one who, and it's probably because where he was when the battle started. But he was there, and then he led the troops back to Fort Apache after the battle. The next one, which is kind of a light-skinned devil down there sitting in the middle, that's Mickey Free.
Oh, this one right
Yeah,
here.
he also was a Mexican captive. Taken his name when he was born was Felix Tejas, and when he was stolen by probably Pinal or Aravaipa Apaches down on Sonoita, right down there, not far from Nogales, he was known as Felix Ward, because his mother was then married to a white man who had a ranch down there. And he was captured by Apaches who were brought up and grew up around Cedar Creek. Later became very famous. He worked with the military for decades up into the 1890s as an Apache scout, as a guide, and as an interpreter. Next to him, the next one is Archie, and the one next to him there. That's the last one we know. His name is Pinal. Pinal was most likely Molly and Cora Cooley's two wives. He was most likely their true brother. Alchese, Euclene, and Petone up there are also related to Cooley's wives, but probably not as closely. So Cooley, this is almost, and there were probably a number of other of their clan relatives that made up a good part of the Apache Scouts. Anyway, after following 1874, Cooley pretty much never worked with the military after that. In 1875, we know that he had moved up onto Sholo Creek and built a cabin there. Because a woman named Martha Summerhays wrote a book called Vanished Arizona, where she talks about coming with her as young people with her lieutenant husband coming to be stationed at Fort Apache. And she spends the night at Cooley's house on Sholo Creek and gives a description of it. And he's there with his two wives. And so we all know that Cooley's living on Sholo Creek in the spring of 1875 because Martha hit Summerhays. In 1876, his wife, they were living out on, they had another cabin out on Silver Creek. Nobody knows where that one is. It's probably very near the fish hatchery on Silver Creek. There's a couple of old springs there. There's a little mound still there that it's right near the Borden Ranch Road and whatnot. It's known as Cooley Knoll, and it's known that because Cooley had a cabin on a spring on Silver Creek near there. Well, in that fall of November 1876, his wife Cora has a daughter who she names Belle, and then she dies a couple of days later from the effects of the childbirth. So they leave there. Apaches will not stay where somebody has died. And they move back into the cabin on Sholo. And they are there in December of 1876, about a month later, when the first two Mormon families show up in Sholo. First two Mormons to come to Sholo. That was in December before Christmas, 1876. And they're in their wagons and their livestock are totally worn out. I mean, they've been coming down from Utah. They've been on the little Colorado River over by Holbrook region on months. And it's the beginning of winter. And when they arrived at Cooley's place, and David Adams, which is the name of one of the guys, the other one was Alfred Clough, and their families. They write in his journal that they found work with Cooley. Basically, Cooley took them in, fed them through the winter, and they provided, I'm sure Mormon people have a tremendous work ethic. I'm sure they did all kinds of things to pay their keep. But when they got to Cooley's place, they were down to eating nothing but their seed corn is the only thing. The corn they brought with them to grow a crop the following spring is the only thing they had to eat. So he saw him through the winter. In February, the first week of February, I forget the exact date, but first week of February, which is like 2 months later, David Adams' wife has a baby. First Mormon child born in Show Low. His name was Lynd Adams. And David Adams writes in his journal that his wife would have died if Molly Cooley had not been there to save her life and the life of his child. So the first Mormon child born in Show Low was delivered by a White Mountain Apache woman. David Adams continued to live in the area. He settled down on Forestdale, which is actually on the reservation, and some years later was forced to leave there. And Clough, I believe, went on down onto the Gila River and settled down in there where now Pima and Thatcher are. And I think there's descendants of David Adams still in the area. I'm not sure if that's the Adams family that I know and went to high school with, but I assume that it is. And there's, of course, so following that, this is about the time when Cooley had a partner named Marion Clark, who had also been in the area. He'd worked for Cooley when he had his little cabin down on North Fork. They went into partnership probably by, we know that Marion Clark was on the Show Low River, camped on he was the only resident listed as in a census as living on the Show Low River in 1874. That's when Cooley was still working for the military. So he hadn't even come up there yet. Or if he had, he went back and went to work for the military. So they're partners in 1875. And they're not partners when the two Mormons show up in 1876. So somewhere along in there is where the card game between Cooley and Clark supposedly had to have taken place, where Cooley stayed and Clark left. He moved upstream about 5 miles, probably about where Navapache office is on Billy Creek and Porter Mountain Road, that intersection in there. That's the most likely location of where he moved to, because he filed for water rights 5 miles upstream from Cooley's. So anyway, so that's when this card game should have taken place. The problem with it can't be the source of the name Show Low, because in 1874, 2 years prior to that, Marion Clark is listed as the only resident living on the Show Low River. So the name Show Low can't come from a card game between Cooley and Clark 2 years later. It had to already be in use. So that I hate to contradict the town fathers in the Chamber of Commerce at Show Low, but that's not the origin of the name. It actually most likely came from a couple of years earlier with the card game with Cooley and Dodd, who were camped on the Show Low Creek and playing a game of cards to see who was going to clean up after dinner. And that's most likely the source of the name Show Low. They were playing a card game where you take tricks and certain cards are worth a point a piece, and you play until somebody gets to 21 or whatever. And one of the cards, you get a point for the lowest card and a point for the highest trump card and for the jack of or whatever. There's a way of. So anyway. If you can show the low card of trump at the end, having taken that trick, then you get a point for that. And so when he showed the lowest card trump, having himself taken the trick, then he got that point and he won the game, and the other guy had to clean up after dinner or chop the wood or whatever it was. Anyway, So that's most likely the source of the name. But
well, that does make a good story.
Yeah, it's a whole lot simpler if you just keep it to Cooley and Clark fighting over a ranch, which was actually about 300 acres of barley. But the other story is much better. Anyway, so in where are we? 1876, 1877. Not long after that, the Mormons start coming in more, particularly 1878, when the flake comes, and there was another guy named Tenney, and they're colonizing mostly the Little Colorado River. They found out that that's a lot harder to do than because of the way it floods and then goes dry and then floods again. It was really hard to ever try and dam it up and irrigate. But the Silver Creek area, that's a different story. It's a little more dependable. It doesn't flood, so they bought out Stinson, a rancher here in Fort Apache,
And
Snowflake, and started what is now Snowflake, named after, what was his name? William Jennings Flake, maybe?
Yeah, and Erastus Snow.
And Erastus Snow. Anyway, at that time, Cooley is still living in Show Low. In 1881, he goes into partnership with a couple of brothers named Huning. Now, the Hunings had been in New Mexico since way back in the 1860s, and they had provided some of this stuff to Fort Apache. And they looked at them and another guy named Saul Barth, who settled over this, basically the creator of St. John's. They realized that if they grew crops here, they could sell them to the fort and not have to bring them all the way from the Rio Grande over in New Mexico to supply the fort. It's really hard to bring anything up through the mountains on the road that they created. The military road they created was just horrendous. Most wagons couldn't even make it through if they had any weight on them. So anyway, and they were always getting attacked by Apaches down there. So they started supplying the fort from New Mexico and from the north, and Hunings had been part of that. And they realized that if they came over and made partnership with Cooley, they could grow crops, they could run cattle and supply the fort from close by. So he went into partnership with them in 1881. They imported the first 500 white-faced Hereford cattle ever into the area. They had some of the finest in the area. Of course, this is exactly the same time that the Hash Knife outfit comes in along the railroad. They owned every other section on either side of the railroad. And of course, there weren't any fences, so they had a claim to every other section, but their cattle were everywhere.
Right.
They were in direct competition with Cooley and Huning. A few years later, about 1878 or 79, Cooley and the Hunings have a falling out. They were actually fighting with each other, but because it was a partnership, they included Cooley is included into that, and the arbitrator, whichever, that was deciding the case, decided that Cooley had to take $10,000 and leave Show Low. That the other two guys were entitled to buy him out, and he couldn't stop it. So he did. He took $10,000 cash, which in those days was a lot of money.
Yes.
But he wasn't happy with it. And he stayed on. I think he even lived in David Adams' house for a little while in Show Low before they built his own house just over the reservation line below Honda. And that, if you want to show that picture, it's a picture of the house that he built. That's the picture that he built, the house that he built just below Honda, about a quarter of a mile below the Honda Casino on a nice, beautiful meadow. He built that house with the help of the Penrods, who were some Mormons who had come into the area by that time.
There's some
There's some people
sit-
there, but it's really hard to tell who they are. The one on the left is obviously Cooley. You can see his white beard.
Mhm.
And who the other two are, maybe some of his children, maybe somebody passing by, maybe it was somebody who brought the camera that's taking the picture. And anyway, that house became very famous among the military people because it's about one day's march out of Fort Apache. It's like 25 miles north of Fort Apache. It's in a very pleasant, 7,000 foot elevation. And the officers would pay $5 a night to stay in one of the rooms and eat dinner and breakfast. And his meals were cooked by Molly and the kids. By that time, he had several. And it just became really famous throughout the military as a place to stay. And he kept a journal that people would sign in on. The early copies are all gone. The only one that still exists is one that was started in the 1890s. And there are a lot of famous names of people who spent the night there.
Does this house still exist?
No. My grandparents continued to live on there after Cooley died. And in 1922, the entire livestock industry throughout the West, not just Arizona, but everywhere, Wyoming, Montana, everywhere, it totally collapsed after the First World War. And all those rich, English lords and all those guys lost their ass along with everybody else. But Cooley, my grandparents, my father's parents, they moved into Fort Apache. Fort Apache was closed in 1922, and they created the Theodore Roosevelt boarding school. And both of my grandparents moved into Fort Apache and got jobs working for the new boarding school. My grandmother ended up being eventually the postmaster at Fort Apache. And then later on, they were going to create a post office in Sibique. In 1935, my grandparents moved from Fort Apache to Sibique. They built a trading post there called Apache Traders, although it was known just as Cooley's store. And they housed the post office in their trading post. So that's how I happened to end up being from Sibique. Mm-hmm. She just Chibiku in Daishkin. I'm a Sibique white boy. There's very few of us. Anyway, we want to get back to the story. That's him. That picture there is taken about 1905, 1906, somewhere right along in there. And that's Cooley sitting on his front porch down at the Cooley Ranch outside of just below Honda. And what's next? Oh, in 1911, he had a stroke. He lived on for another 5-6 years. But this picture here was taken in 1916. And it can be, that's Molly standing right behind him. The baby in arms here is my Uncle Don. He was born in 1916. That's how we know when the picture was taken. The two nurses, one holding the baby, was there as a midwife when my grandmother gave birth to her first son, Don, also Corydon. That name keeps coming up in the family. And the other nurse was a nurse that had been hired before. I think she was from El Paso, but she'd come to take care of the old man in his old age after he suffered a stroke. This picture was taken not long before he died, probably a year or less before he died. You got another one. The next one is that's Troop L of the 10th Cavalry at Fort Apache. They were the honor guard that fired the volleys when he died. They brought him back down to Fort Apache, and he's still there in the military cemetery at Fort Apache. Was where he was buried, and the military did their stuff, their funeral for him, even though he really hadn't been in the U.S. Army per se. He'd been in the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry, during the Civil War. And the daughters of the first New Mexico volunteers or something, created a headstone and brought it to Fort Apache and put it on his grave. They got the date of his, the dates wrong, both the of the year and the month, or the year and the day that he died is wrong on but they had good intentions.
Right.
So basically all of my family, except so far, my father and my grandmother and grandfather, great-grandmother, great-grandfather, great-aunt, whatever, they're all buried in that military cemetery at Fort Apache. But that's the honor guard that was fired the volleys over his grave at that particular time. And then there's one more picture. This picture is taken about 1920. That's Molly Cooley with her back to the camera. She did not like be around people or have her picture taken. And the members, those are her children, and some of their husbands are and our wives in the picture. That was probably taken about 1920, and it's on the back porch there at the Cooley Ranch.
Okay.
That we showed the picture of before. And it was probably somebody's birthday or something like that. I don't, maybe it was even her birthday. Or anyway, everybody gathered to one last time, and that's just before she died. She lived a couple of years after Cooley died, and then she died too at the old ranch.
Okay.
So
is that all the pictures?
Yeah.
Is your father in that picture?
No, my father was born in 1920, but not when that picture was taken.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So my father, his birthday was just the other day, May 13th, and he would have been, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, May 13th. He would have been 102 years old if he was still
wow.
But he's been dead for many years. My father was a combat veteran from World War II, also a member of the tribe. And he fought on Saipan, Iwo Jima. When we buried him, he still had shrapnel in his legs from a Japanese mortar on Guam.
Oh, my goodness.
He died fairly young, in his mid-50s, from a ruptured appendix.
Wow.
Healthcare on the reservation has improved dramatically in the last 40 years.
Sounds like another story for another time.
Another story.
That's what I was going to say. You had an absolutely fantastic story to tell us, and it kind of sounds like this is a good place to kind of wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah. Is there any kind of questions anybody I might know the answer to?
Well, I have one. Very early on, you mentioned the other city, town, outpost with Denver. Is that now today outside of Denver? There's Aurora, Colorado. Is there any?
This was actually Aurora. It's different.
Okay,
and it was kind of swallowed by the Denver. I don't know that name even exists anymore. Because the Denver Town Company was more successful than the Aurora Town Company.
Okay, so there's no known link between where Aurora, Colorado is today
and where Aurora was. I don't think they're the same place. No, I'm not exactly sure, but I do not think they are the same place and just slightly changed in name. There was a record of Cooley being there. Him and some others were the first board of directors for a church, an Episcopal church there, known as St. John in the Wilderness or something like that. And that church still exists in Denver.
Oh, okay. So Denver.
And it was in their records that they found his name as one of the original organizers or something.
Very good.
There's a story in our family that one time a traveling priest, Catholic priest, stopped by for the night, and Cooley being Irish name, they sat up all night drinking and talking. And the next morning he insisted that everybody in the family, everybody that was there, had to get baptized in the Catholic church.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
He was quite
Yeah.
a character. I mean, he was known as a very jovial man, had a wonderful sense of humor. I could tell you one story if you got just a minute later. Goes back to the old cavalry days. Supposedly, this young lieutenant, in the course of his duties, had gone out and had ended up having to kill one of the local Apaches. And it was and his family, the local Apache's family, let it be known that they were going to come Apache justice. We're going to come hunt this guy down and kill him. Well, Cooley was probably the best informed man in the country because he had connections both with the military and with the Apaches. So he knew probably more about what was going on than anybody. And he'd heard this story, and he came in and he went and he talked to the one lieutenant who was known to have a couple of really fine horses. And he says, well, give me one of your horses and I'll go talk to the guy's close relatives and we see if we can't make some kind of arrangement here. So, okay. So he takes the horse and he goes, sees the guy's brother or father or whoever, close relatives anyway. And he says, this is not right. You hunting this guy down. He was doing, your relative had done these bad things and he was in, and it was a fair fight. And, but he feels bad. The lieutenant feels bad and he wants to give you this horse to kind of make up for it. And so they accept the horse. And, okay, he may not be safe out away from the fort if he's by himself. We can't speak for all of our relatives. Somebody might still take a shot at him, but we're not going to hunt him down and kill him. So Cooley goes back and he talks to the young lieutenant, and he doesn't tell him that. He does tell him, well, the horse did the trick. And they said, as a matter of fact, they have a couple of other relatives they don't like very much. And each one of them is going to be worth such a fine horse, you can ask them to come kill them too. So that was, but it's not, he just had a way of making fun of things. He apparently was a wonderful storyteller on that vein. And, but he was not a liar per se. He just was just great at humorous embellishments. And
That definitely was a different era than we're living in today.
the only other thing I think really came down to me from the family, down through the family, was two things. One thing was they asked him how he was able to get along with all these people whenever so many other people got killed trying to do the same thing. And he says, well, it's easy to get along with almost any group of people if you'll just give the men tobacco and leave the women alone. And when I was young, my father started to teach me to shoot firearms when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And later on, when I was a little older, he told me that the Cooley family has always believed that a proficiency with firearms is essential to a young man's education. Now, I'm not particularly prone to fight shooting guns. I haven't touched one in decades. But when I was young, I could hit what I shoot on.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I think we better go ahead and end the meeting. And I'm sure you've got more stories. I'd love to have you come back at a future date. And
I'd love to hear some more.
Yes. Yes.
Well,
thank you.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. And with that, I'll go ahead and end this meeting.
It was a pleasure to meet both of you.
And
maybe in person someday.
Yes, maybe we should all get together when John's out here and have lunch or something.
Oh, yes.
Definitely.
I'd definitely like to go to dinner or lunch or whatever.
Yeah.
Very good. Let's work on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I'll say goodbye and go ahead and end the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.